"She's Japanese," said Karen from the real estate agent. I noticed a note of concern in her voice, as if she felt compelled to warn me. "That's fine," I said. I had no prejudice against the Japanese. It was my father, not me, who had suffered at their hands in the war, and my father was already dead. "So I can bring her to see the cabin tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Mr. Weston?" Karen was visibly cheerful. I said yes and hung up the phone. When I told my wife that the tenant in the cottage on our property might be a Japanese woman, she wasn't too interested. "I think she'll keep the house nice and clean," she said. Karen brought her in her car at the appointed time. My wife Danielle watched them sitting by the window in her stroller. She didn't feel like meeting the woman who had arrived right away. Danielle was not timid, but the progression of her illness had intensified her natural reticence. I went out to meet the visitors. Karen introduced her companion to me as Mrs. Naga. Mrs. Naga added, "Just Yuki," and from then on she was Yuki to us, and after closer acquaintance, Yuki. She is tall for a Japanese woman, I thought, about 5 feet 8 inches, slender with a thin waist and a striking, almost absurdly correct face. Its features were fine and graceful, lips the color of ripe raspberries that needed no lipstick. I'm not sure I could call this woman a beauty. Everyone has his own idea of beauty, which is far from objective, but she certainly had charm and allure. She smiled not only with her lips, but with her whole face, and her expressive almond-shaped brown eyes shone. The only thing that spoiled her, in my opinion, was her hair. Black as a raven's wing and shiny, they were quite sparse and hung down from the forehead, so that under them you could easily guess the outline of the skull. On the top of her head, they were arranged in a flat hairdo and looked like a black lake, cut through by a single gray strand that flowed like a water snake near her left temple. I suppose it was the work of a stylist, though somehow it didn't look that way to me. The Japanese woman had silky skin of the softest peach color, smooth without a single blemish, like a new cut of silk. Was I attracted to her? This topic is still strangely painful to me. I can only say that when she was in the same room as my wife, I tried not to look at her for too long. My wife Danielle was very observant. Then, on the day we first met, I noticed how elegantly dressed she was, all black, but with a bright scarlet scarf carelessly thrown over her shoulder. I wasn't surprised to hear that she was associated with the fashion industry. Yuki said she was a designer, but in what field? Whether she designed fabrics, clothing, or accessories remained unclear. She came to our country so that her 9-year-old son Lee could attend an English school. In Japan, she said, education was too traditional, and she decided that something different was needed for Lee. She had heard of Springfield School in Suffolk, just a few miles away. Founded in the 1920s, it was a highly liberal school, popular the world over for its eccentricities and its emphasized rejection of authoritarianism. Pupils could attend classes of their choice, get up and go to bed whenever they wanted, and so on. Needless to say, there were various rumors of more scandalous incidents as well. One way or another, Yuki was determined to put Lee there. Apparently, her father's opinion, whoever he was and wherever he was not taken into consideration. Yuki Naga was a determined lady. I took Karen and Yuki down the road to show them the cottage. It was a barn converted for housing, of brick paneled with black boards, 1 story, but with a bedroom and bath in the attic. I'm not sure there was anything Japanese about the cottage, but the loose layout, the concise combination of wood and plain whitewashed walls could probably have appealed to a Japanese woman. Yuki seemed to like it, and she was especially delighted to find a pond with a weeping willow leaning over the mirror water. There must have been something Japanese about it, especially since there was also a cherry tree in bloom nearby. Yuki enjoyed admiring the corner, though she didn't get too close to the shore. After looking around, a smiling Yuki nodded to our agent Karen, from which I concluded that the deal was done. The Japanese woman had rented Manor Farm Cottage, agreeing to the price we'd set. She and her son Lee moved in the following week, and the first night I invited them to have dinner with us. Danielle was more interested in her new neighbors this time. Then I met Lee, and the boy impressed me. Danielle and I didn't have children of our own, and it wasn't my custom to fawn over other people's offspring. But Lee was an unusual child. Unusually like his mother, with a regular oval face and flawless, silky skin. His hair, as sparse as Yuki's, was quite long, so from a distance one could easily mistake him for a girl. Lee was surprisingly polite and compliant, and remarkable for his restraint, almost unnatural for a 9-year-old. That was probably the only thing that confused me about him. The boy didn't speak much, as his English was even worse than Yuki's, but I remembered one short dialogue. I told Yuki that I had once been an actor, and she translated it to her son. Through the mother, he asked me, "Were you a waki or a shite?" Japanese theater, particularly No, has a strict canonical structure, and the role of an actor, as far as I understand it, can be either waki or shite, which is pronounced sti. Each role is endowed with strictly defined characteristics, and the shite tend to play leading roles. I replied that I had been both waki and shite at different times. This clearly puzzled Lee, but he didn't say another word about it. Yuki's English left much to be desired, but she was very charming and, in her own way, interesting as a conversationalist. She showed interest in our house and the paintings on the walls and very tactfully helped Danielle if needed. Both Yuki and Lee were very natural with Danielle, as if they didn't notice her disability, and for that I was very grateful. I began to think about inviting Yuki to a dinner party and introducing her to a small group of our friends. Although Lee found himself excluded from most of our conversations due to his lack of language skills, he didn't seem to care, especially since he took a liking to our black and white cat, Laura. After dinner, the two of them frolicked around while Yuki, Danielle, and I drank coffee in the living room. A large English Empire-style mirror hangs above the fireplace there, and as I offered Yuki a seat next to my wife's stroller, opposite the mirror, I noticed that she resolutely sat down with her back to it. This interested me fleetingly, as did the fact that our Laura, who was showing favor with Lee in every way possible, was definitely trying to keep her distance from Yuki. After they left, I exchanged a few remarks about Yuki with Danielle, noting that we were lucky to have a lodger. Laura jumped into Danielle's lap and purred and poked her nose in, demanding that Danielle pet her. "Yes, she's adorable," Danielle said in that emphatically neutral tone she'd used in recent years when she wanted to make a point but wasn't in the mood for long conversations. I remained silent and took it to heart. My days, apart from caring for Danielle, are spent in idleness. I can't leave my wife alone, so I no longer work as an actor, but I do some work for an advertising firm. I work from home, so I was able to satisfy my curiosity by watching Yuki. During the week while Lee lived at the boarding house in Spearfield, Yuki was gone all day long, but she always showed up at home at different times. On one occasion, noticing her door unlocked, I went down to the cottage and knocked. I used the traditional homeowner excuse of asking if everything was okay and if I needed help. Yuki was just hanging a painting, and I offered to help. With a smile, she invited me in. I marveled at how she had managed to turn the interior of the cottage into a Japanese cottage. The Turkish carpets had been removed, replaced by Japanese mats on the polished floor. The upholstered furniture was covered with simple capes of white or unbleached cloth. All Western paintings and decorations had been removed. I didn't mind this. Yuki did everything with my permission, even though she was paying for the cottage furnished, just marveled at the scale of the transformation. With a hammer, I hammered a hook into the wall for the painting. It was a Japanese print depicting an old man sweeping fallen leaves behind a pond framed by laurels and other plants. The sky in the painting was dark, and there was a large moon with a bat flying in the background. Despite this, the main part of the painting was not darkened or hidden in shadow, and this gave it a strange, unrealistic look. It was like one of Magritte's paintings with the bright daytime sky and the dark, dimly lit streets, only here it was the other way around. Actually, quite beautiful, I thought, all except the old man. His wrinkled face was contorted with anguish, so that he looked like the soul of a sinner in hell. On a branch of a tree beyond the lake hung some flat, round object that looked like a tambourine. As the painting took its place on the wall, Yuki thanked me for my help and then asked, "How come your wife Danielle is in a wheelchair?" The question caught me off guard. To ask it like that, without preamble or apology. I answered as briefly and dryly as possible, expecting the sympathy that both my wife and I can't stand, but it was not forthcoming. Yuki simply smiled, a smile that was not at all appropriate, I thought, and nodded, as if the diagnosis, multiple sclerosis, confirmed her assumptions. When is she going to die? The second question startled me to the point where I wasn't even offended. I mumbled something vague, feeling guilty for answering at all. Then Yuki uttered, "Please, can I ask you one more question? Please." I braced myself for another invasion of privacy. "There is a lake in your garden. Can I walk around it?" "Of course." In addition to the small pond next to the cottage, we also have a lake fed by keys. "Thank you so much, Weston-san." And she bowed politely. Taking that gesture as a hint that it was time to get out of her territory, I bowed out. I thought back to Yuki's strange behavior for quite some time, remembering how unceremoniously she'd asked about my wife's condition while asking permission to walk on our land near the lake. Another confirmation that west is west, east is east, and together they cannot come together. I also noticed another oddity. Yuki had taken down the mirror in the big room, and in its place had hung several Japanese theatrical masks, molded and painted from the wall. Masks, molded and painted very skillfully. One of them looked almost exactly like Yuki's face, except that the color was a little whiter. The smile and the dimples on her cheeks were exactly the same, but the emptiness in the place of her eyes gave the mask an unpleasantly blurred expression. I myself was annoyed that Yuki wasn't getting out of my head. When I noticed that I was thinking about her again, I would dismiss those thoughts, but she raised so many unanswered questions. I even bought a Japanese phrase book at a second-hand bookstore so I could understand a little of her language. I didn't show Danielle the book, knowing she wouldn't approve of the purchase. I often found myself looking out the window, which had a good view of Yuki's cottage, but most of the time the curtains were drawn. The lake on our property lies at the foot of the slope on which our garden sits, and is framed by alder and willow trees. It is clearly visible from our house, but not from the cottage. I've mowed a path along the bank, and on nice days, when it's dry underfoot, I take Danielle out there in her stroller. I usually get up early to have some alone time with myself before I start grooming Danielle. In this quiet early hour, I walk around the house, feed my cat Laura, and pull back the curtains, letting the day in. During this time, I forget about Danielle's disability, and yes, in her own way, she forgets about it while she sleeps. One morning I remember standing at the living room window, which has a marvelous view of the lake. The sun had just risen, and had not yet dried the dew that glistened faintly on the grass. Threads of mist stretched over the lake. By the water, I saw a woman standing with her back to me. She was naked, and her skin was as white as a sheet of paper in the morning light, so that I wondered if it was a mirage. Her long, loose black hair with a thin white strand fell down, covering her body all the way to her buttocks, so that her thin waist was barely visible. It was Yuki. With a confident, unhurried stride, like a priestess performing a ritual immersion, she stepped into the lake. Here she plunged in up to her thighs, just a slight ripple in the water. A few more steps, and her black hair fanning across the surface. When the water rose to her waist, Yuki smoothly raised her arms and swam breaststroke, still softly, hardly disturbing the water, except for a few quietly diverging circles. I kept my eyes on her, telling myself that the lake, after all, belonged to me, and therefore I had the right to watch the spectacle. Besides, as it seemed to me, my feelings and experiences in these moments were far from sexual. I was overwhelmed by a desire to possess her, but in the way that one might want to possess a fine object, such as an ivory statue one sees in the window of an antique shop. That morning was astonishingly quiet, and in the stillness I seemed to hear the blood rushing through my veins and my heart beating a drum beat. Laura, having satisfied her hunger, came over and began to rub against my legs. I didn't move and continued to watch. Meanwhile, Yuki, having swum deep, dived in without disturbing the water, which looked like a dark, spotless mirror. She didn't rise to the surface for 15 seconds, then 30, so I began to wonder if I was imagining her. 30 seconds turned into a minute, and my doubts turned into feverish excitement. I was ready to rush to the lake and rescue her. Finally, she surfaced and swam silently toward me. Strangely, she let her wet hair completely cover her face, so I couldn't see it. When she came ashore, the water flowed down, seeming to envelop her like a veil. At one point, she stopped abruptly and raised her head, still covered on all sides by her hair. It was like an animal suddenly sensing danger. I was sure she had somehow realized that I was watching her. Gingerly, with a nimbleness that was also something of an animal, she crouched down and turned her face away from me. Straightening up, she turned her back to me, clutching something white in her hand. It was a garment, or maybe a towel. Yuki threw it over her shoulders and ran like 7 demons, chasing her across the bank, across the grass to her cottage. I turned away from the window, not wanting to be seen or seen. I could see her breasts, small but perfectly shaped, and her nipples, like her lips, were the color of ripe raspberries. For the next few days, I avoided talking to Yuki at all costs. I tried to keep myself busy by writing notes for a trade magazine and the like. Danielle, whose powers of observation had not been dulled by the illness, but rather sharpened, immediately noticed my unusual, distracted state. No matter how hard I tried to hide it, I failed. Danielle's sharp, intuitive mind told her a way to shake me up and help me calm down. She suggested we call the guests and reminded them that we were going to introduce our friends and neighbors to our charming tenant Yuki. I agreed, realizing that any objection on my part would immediately stir up new suspicions. In the village, you can sometimes become attached to people who are quite ordinary simply because they live in the neighborhood and are quite cute and nice. So we invited the Howards and the Spences. I call them mediocre, but I can't help but admit that Danielle and I have become just as mediocre as they are over the years. The choice of guests was almost inevitable because, among other things, we had taken advantage of their hospitality on more than one occasion. It was quite difficult to find an available male to pair with Yuki, but Danielle was strangely insistent that there should be 4 couples at the table. In the end, to keep up appearances, we invited Justin. Justin lived in our town in a small house. He was an artist. It would be more accurate to say that he painted something and called himself an artist, but I had never heard of anyone buying one of his paintings. He lived off the small fortune he inherited. In general, I liked his way of life. Unlike many artists, he never complained that his genius was undervalued, probably because he never tried to impose it on others. At the same time, I respected him for having found a purpose in life. Justin was about 50 years old, tall and thin. He was attractive, but too shy to be attracted to women. He had that slight carelessness that often characterizes bachelors who are not young. He wasn't stupid, at least, in our neighborhood. Such unusual people are more likely to be considered interesting. Yuki was the first to arrive. It was a warm July evening, and we decided to serve drinks on the terrace overlooking the lake. Danielle and I immediately noticed how our lodger's English had improved over the past 2 weeks. Strangely, it only made her seem even more exotic, even more Japanese, as she managed to translate the ceremonial turns of her language into equally ceremonial English. Upon entering the house, Yuki first handed Danielle a dwarf bonsai tree in a pot, then handed me something wrapped in black silk paper. "This has to do with the theater and will be of interest to you as a famous and popular artist," she said. I had encountered such unjustifiably flattering Japanese turns of phrase before, and I realized that there was no need to dismiss it by assuring that I had never been famous or popular. We both knew it was nonsense, just part of the game. Unfolding the paper roll, I found inside a book. Ancient Plays of Japanese No Theater, in the translation of The Lady. The tome, dated 1867, was bound in burlap and printed on what appeared to be handmade paper. The book was adorned with full-page black and white illustrations. I thanked her for such an unusual rarity, and Yuki bowed to me in return. She explained that she had found the book at a local second-hand bookstore. The next guest was Justin with a shaggy bouquet of flowers from his garden that he had presented to Danielle. He was dressed in his typical fashion. His shirt and jacket looked almost dapper, but the jeans he was obviously working in were covered in paint. Yuki seemed embarrassed by this display of British eccentricity. Egotists like Justin can be incredibly charming, and for about 20 minutes he showed the three of us his best qualities. But as soon as the Spences and Howards appeared, he turned his attention completely to Yuki. From that moment until the very end of the evening, he, one might say, monopolized her. It's hard to tell if he mesmerized her or she mesmerized him, but there was definitely a spark of mutual affection between them. I must confess that at first I was hurt by this, but I did nothing to prevent it, in part because my interference would have aroused Danielle's suspicions. Besides, I couldn't decide whether to warn Justin about Yuki or the other way around. When the guests left, I said to Danielle, "Well, it seems to have gone well." At other times, this banal beginning would have been the starting point for a discussion about our guests and the relationship between them. Such conversations Danielle and I had so far enjoyed having, but this time my wife didn't want to wash over anyone's bones. In a rather abrupt tone, she asked me to help her lie down. I was curious as to what was going on, but I didn't want to annoy her. After getting Danielle settled, I made my way to my office to have a final drink of whiskey alone. I often think the best thing about hosting guests is the silence that comes afterward. An owl screeched in the darkness outside the window. I almost jumped up and was unpleasantly surprised at my own agitation. My nerves were strained to the limit. I picked up Yuki's gift and flipped through the book page by page. The plays of the No Theater are not very much like dramas in our sense. They consist mainly of narration and stage directions, interspersed with poems, songs, and dances. To the Western reader, they look more like a ritual action or a worship service, with exclamations and lyrical insertions, and in spite of their rather lightweight plots, they are characterized by great expressiveness. The action takes place as if in a dream. Everything seems mysterious and shaky. Cruelty and rudeness, sometimes peculiar to them, do not spoil them at all and even add to their charm. I turned the pages absent-mindedly and was surprised to recognize one illustration as the picture that had hung on Yuki's wall. The engraving was not in color but in black and white, all the lines thicker and coarser, and yet it was the same image. An old man sweeping up fallen leaves behind a pond. A serpentine of twisted black wrinkles on his face simply but expressively conveyed both the age of the old man and his mental anguish. On the branches of a tree leaning over the pond hung an object that looked like a tambourine. On a neighboring page was the beginning of a play called Aya no Tsuzumi, Brocade Drum. Behind the list of characters was the first line of a character identified as a judicial officer, Waki. Before you is an official from the Moon Palace in Chukugen Province. Let me tell you the history of this place. Long ago, a beautiful princess lived in the Moon Palace, surrounded by a lovely garden. An old gardener often came here and swept the fallen leaves around the laurel pond. One day, he met a princess and fell in love with her. The old man was very foolish. For once he dared to confess his love to the princess. But she was born of the spirit of water, so she had no heart, and when she was alone, she had no face. It was as if the princess took pity on the old man. In the branches of a laurel tree by the pond, she hung a drum and told him to beat the drum whenever he wanted to see her. The drumming would reach the palace of the moon. She would hear and come. But when the old man tried to beat the drum, it turned out that the princess had played a cruel trick on him. Instead of leather, the drum was covered with brocade, and therefore did not make a sound. The old man beat the drum again and again in vain. Finally, he went mad with despair and threw himself into the laurel pond. And now his evil spirit wanders around the laurel pond, suffering unbearable torment, and those who come here at night hear the brocade drum beating in their heads. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about what I had read, about this strange, unusual story. I couldn't get the story out of my head, despite its cruel pointlessness, or maybe because of it. In restless dreams, I seemed to grasp something important, but when I woke up, it was slipping away. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer and decided to get up. Laura was very pleased to be fed earlier than usual. Gently rubbing her face against my hand, she poked her nose impatiently at the bag of food I had opened. I went out into the living room, determined to clean up after my guests. Going to the window, I opened the curtains. The grass was wet with dew. The edge of the sun barely showed above the horizon in a thin, cloudy haze. The fog over the lake, like a cluster of ghosts, was swirling in bizarre shapes. Yes, I admit it, had hoped to see a naked Yuki plunging into the waters of the lake again, but there was no sign of her. Of course she wasn't. Why would she be there? That's a stupid thought. On the shore of the pond, I saw a figure, but fully clothed and belonging to a man. I could not recognize him at once because of the fog. The man was walking along the shore with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slumped. Some kind of strange trespasser. What was he doing here? Was he waiting for someone? I went to get my glasses and looked again. Now I could clearly see it was Justin. Seeing this slacker, who fancied himself an artist, walking calmly across my land, made my anger flare up. I was even about to go downstairs and politely, of course, but firmly reprimand him, but that's when Danielle called out to me from her bedroom. After doing my usual routine, I went back into the living room, but Justin was gone. Undoubtedly, something was going on between him and Yuki. I often saw Justin pacing the path to her cottage. If I waved or called out to him, he pretended not to notice or responded with a careless nod. Often he carried a paintbrush and a bucket of paint or a toolbox, probably to justify his frequent visits to Yuki's house. I could have argued that repairing or fixing things was my business, not his, but for some reason I didn't. When Lee was home, Justin could be seen playing with the boy on the lawn, tossing him a tennis ball or indulging in other childish activities. The artist, it seemed to me, had become a slave to Yuki and her son. I remember once watching Justin take Lee around the lawn on a cart, which he had stuffed with cushions for comfort. It was a hot August day, and sweat was streaming down Justin's face. Every time he stopped, Lee shouted angrily for another lap. Yuki watched them from her window. Her face was impassive, her eyes seemed like dark slits. I suddenly felt like she was wearing a mask from the wall instead of her own face. As time passed, my anxiety and even fear about Yuki and Justin intensified. Even now, I couldn't fully explain what was bothering me. I even shared it with Danielle, even though I knew I wouldn't find her sympathy. Lately, she had been sinking more and more into herself. Fast-paced illnesses and disabilities have that effect on people sometimes. When I mentioned Yuki and Justin, trying to keep my voice light, I said something like, "I just don't know what their relationship is." Danielle looked at me with that intense, probing gaze that went straight to my soul. "You'd better put them out of your mind," she advised, and thank fate that it wasn't you she stuck her claws into. In other words, I should mind my own business. And Danielle was right, of course. I tried not to think about them, but it was hard. One evening in mid-September, fall was starting to creep up on us. I settled Danielle in front of the TV, serving her a light dinner while I went for a walk myself. I walked down the road to the creek that separated us from the neighboring village and headed for the ford, admiring the light that trickled down from the sky through the black trees. By the time I got back, it was darker than I had expected. Walking up the road, I glanced down at Yuki's cottage. The curtains of one of the windows in the living room had been pulled back, revealing an interior flooded with yellow lamplight. At the back of the wall, I made out theater masks hung there instead of a mirror. In front of them were two people. Yuki was standing and Justin was sitting or kneeling in front of her. I couldn't see. Yuki's face was almost completely obscured by her long black hair. They also covered her entire figure almost to her hips. She was naked. Although the woman was standing half-turned toward me, I could make out the outline of her breasts and crimson nipple. Justin's face was clearly visible, and his expression shocked me. He was looking down at her in confusion and horror. I just couldn't help but move closer. Yuki raised her hand and began pouring some kind of liquid from a cup over Justin's head. The artist's fear was replaced by agony, as if from a sharp pain, and he covered his face with his hands. I heard Yuki laughing. It was an eerie laugh, shrill, like the cry of a beast. Not a laugh, but a cruel mockery, without a shadow of mirth or humanity. I took another step, almost daring to intervene, but at that instant something hit my head, and with a thin squeak, clattered in my hair. Brushing it off, I touched something. It wasn't feathers, it wasn't a bird. It only lasted a second or two, but I think my hand felt the fur and leathery wing of a bat. I rushed away with all my legs. After this incident, I withdrew even more into myself. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, Danielle didn't notice it. She was completely absorbed in the deterioration of her condition at the time. I now had a regular nurse to care for her, which freed up more time to speculate. A few days passed, and I was out for a walk when I stealthily reached Justin's cabin. A morbid curiosity stirred in me, and I stepped closer, eager to satisfy it. It was a workman's cottage, barely big enough for a standard cottage, with 2 rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs, and a kitchenette in the annex. The front door was closed, so I decided to look for Justin in the workshop, a brick shed at the back of the garden. The door there was open, and I glimpsed the owner inside, standing with his back to me, facing 1 or 2 easels with canvases standing on them. I didn't want to go unnoticed much longer, and knocked gently on the door. Justin flinched violently and turned around. "Jesus, where did you pop out from?" I was shocked at how much he'd aged since the last time we'd seen each other, since the last time I saw him. There were deep wrinkles covering his face now that I hadn't noticed before. Deep furrows ran down his cheeks and down from his nostrils to the corners of his mouth, the gray-purple lines around his eyes speaking of sleeplessness. His unbrushed, liquid hair was sticking up in all directions, and there was a noticeable amount of gray in it, and it was raging on his temples like foam on stormy waves. At first I thought he was crazy, but maybe it was the light or my thoughts. "Forgive me," the artist said, trying to pull himself together. "I just don't like to be distracted while I'm working. Work, he called it. A bit presumptuous, in my opinion." "Curious," I said, nodding at the canvases. Justin's paintings were reminiscent of the sentimental, semi-abstract style of Willem de Kooning, an artist he admired. The 2 canvases in front of me seemed more organized or something, and not as abstract as his other works. Both depicted roughly the same scene, a woman standing by a pond bordered by trees. The woman, depicted schematically but quite expressively, was wearing a Japanese kimono. In one of the paintings, the woman was leaning over the water, her long black hair with a single white strand flowing down, completely covering her face. But there was no reflection of her in the water. In the second painting, she stood at full height, and her face, framed by her black hair, had no features, just a smooth white oval, like an egg. Behind her in the bushes hung a tambourine-like object covered in a patterned cloth. "Were you trying to impersonate Yuki? Get out! Look, it's... Get out!" "That's what I did." When I saw the rage on Justin's face, I realized it was useless to talk to him now. When I went outside, the cold fall wind was blowing the leaves off the trees. That evening, I caught another glimpse of Justin from my window. He was raking dry leaves from the lawn in front of Yuki's cottage. His face was vaguely white in the window, and I realized she was watching him. One morning, about a week later, I saw a woman shaving down the lane. She had probably gone down to the cottage before and was coming back from there, looking a bit hesitant. Her car was parked by the roadside. When she saw me, she flinched, but calmed down when I smiled and asked if I could help. "I'm Leonie," the woman introduced herself, pronouncing her name with the stress on the second syllable. "I'm the vice principal at Springfield High School, and I'm in charge of the welfare and health of the students." Leonie looked to be in her 40s, a shapeless figure in a gray-green dress of hand-woven fabric. Her long face sagged, with homemade beads of copper discs around her neck. I thought, perhaps naively, that she looked a little too haggard for an employee of a so-called free school. "I called yesterday and made an appointment with Mrs. Naga to see her this morning, but she doesn't seem to be home." "Her car is not in the parking lot. She must have left." "That's a shame. And you are?" "I'm John Weston. I rent this cottage to her. I live in the bigger house over there." "I see," Leonie said with a faint note of disapproval in her voice. "Do you know when she'll be back?" "Alas, I have no idea. Mrs. Naga is her own mistress." "Yes," said Leonie. My last words seemed to have touched her in some way. Something. "You know, I'd like to wait and see if she comes back soon. May I?" Of course. So I invited her inside for coffee. At first, Leonie was tense, but when she saw Danielle in her wheelchair, she relaxed a bit. While I was making coffee, Leonie was talking to my wife about something. Communication in moderation was still enjoyable for Danielle, but she got tired quickly, especially if she had to say something to the guests herself. Every minute, Leonie went to the window to see if Yuki's car was in the parking lot behind the cottage. When we finally sat down to coffee, Leonie said, "Tell me, Mrs. Weston, Danielle, if I may, can I be frank with you?" "Of course," Danielle replied, looking at me questioningly. She was beginning to tire. "It's about Lee, Mrs. Naga's son." "Oh yes, wonderful boy." His wife's neutral and polite words surprised Leonie. "Well, how can I put it? He can be difficult. I don't mean to say it's his fault. We don't do judgmental behavior in Springfield, but there's clearly been some psychological trauma here. We can't rule out abuse from the father. That's why I asked Mrs. Naga to see me. Lee is a capable boy, but he can be very aggressive. I have a duty of care to all children, not just one. As you know, Springfield's ethics are not based on authoritarianism. We don't have strict rules, but we do have some minimum requirements. You know what I mean? Lee has a lot of terrible behavior, especially with the girls." "He's only 9 years old." I know. But that's not all. There are other things, much worse. I can't talk about it, of course. And then there's his games with fire. Twice he tried to set fire to the tree shack on the school grounds. Not just that, but when there were kids inside. And he also throws dead frogs in our vegetarian food. At least they were dead when we found them there. You know, in Springfield's 80-plus years of existence, we've never had to expel a student. But I'm afraid we're gonna have to do it now. I'm sorry, Danielle, to burden you with all this." When Leonie set the coffee cup on the table, her hand was shaking. "It's all right, Leonie," Danielle replied in a tired voice. "Believe me, I don't mean to be intolerant, but that boy is just a nasty, evil devil. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Weston. I shouldn't have said that." Excitedly breaking her arms, Leonie stood up and went to the window. Yuki still hadn't shown up. Turning away from the window, Leonie saw that Danielle, who was suddenly overcome with fatigue, had fallen asleep right in the stroller. This was happening to her more and more often lately. "I'm sorry," Leonie repeated and slipped out of the house. Soon there was the sound of a motor, and she drove away. Yuki didn't get home until 6 o'clock. I heard her car pull into the parking lot as I was preparing dinner. I thought I should tell her about Leonie's arrival, so after we'd eaten and Danielle was settled in front of the TV, I went down to the cottage and knocked on the door. The curtains were drawn and the lights were on, so Yuki was definitely home, but no one answered the knock. Maybe she hadn't heard. I knocked louder, but there was still no answer. So I walked around the cottage and knocked softly on the living room window. Almost immediately, the curtain was pulled back, and Yuki's face appeared before me, her eyes blackened with fury. Then her expression changed, and I realized that she recognized me and motioned for me to come to the entrance. Yuki, who opened the door for me, smiled with feigned modesty, but I couldn't escape the feeling that she was just a mask hiding her true thoughts. A silk kimono of delicate peach-colored silk hung around her ankles, and her black hair was scattered over her shoulders. Where only the Western chic of her designer outfits had gone, she now appealed to an older archetype. "Is there something you wanted to tell me?" I briefly recounted to her everything we had heard that day from Leonie. Yuki listened impassively, with a smile frozen like a mask on her lips. Then she said, "It doesn't matter. I'm taking Lee out of Springfield anyway. Stupid school, and he hates it. I think we're going home to Japan." "When?" "Soon. Very soon." I reminded her that, as her landlord, she had to give me a month's notice. "It'll be all right," she assured me in a nonchalant tone. Her indifference made me impatient. I wanted to slap the mask off her at all costs. "What about Justin?" I asked. "Did you tell him you were leaving?" For a brief moment, I saw the surprise on her face. "I've broken your mask," I thought. But then she began to laugh, that shrill, shrill laugh that didn't even sound like laughter. Her mouth was wide open, letting me see her small, sharp, perfectly shaped teeth and her bright scarlet palate. The laughter went on until, feeling it was becoming unbearable, I walked out. It was getting dark, and the full moon hung in the clear night sky. Yuki had stopped laughing, and I heard nothing else but the quiet squeaking in the gutter of the cottage. There, almost at the corner of the house, hung something that looked like a black leather bag. I stared for a while, hesitating to get closer, much less touch it. I realized from the faint twitching that I was looking at a living creature, and then the bottom of the bag lifted. I saw the head. It was a bat. I had no doubt about that now. They were having a sleepover on our roof, and I sympathized with these animals. But the one hanging here was much larger than the usual non-bats we're used to. Its dark brown, snub-nosed face with bulging black eyes was about to come into view. I wanted to get away, but I couldn't. Finally, I saw its face. It was not dark at all, but white, almost like a mask, almost like a human face, but the black eyes glowed with a senseless, savage hatred. As soon as I got to the house, Danielle asked her to put her down. The caregiver duties helped me take my mind off the incidents of the night, to forget about her strange creepiness. I even almost believed I was the victim of a trick of the senses, or a practical joke. The next morning, I called Karen's agency and asked them to handle Yuki's departure. I decided to stay away from the Japanese girl myself. A few days passed, and during that time, much to my relief, I didn't see Yuki, Lee, or Justin once. I live in a quiet corner of a quiet little town in a quiet part of Suffolk. The nights here are usually almost silent, except for the occasional screech of an owl or the yelp of a fox. That night, 5 days after my last conversation with Yuki, was also quiet and peaceful. The moon was just waning in the cloudless sky. Danielle and I had both gone to bed early. Since she'd been sick, we'd taken separate bedrooms. It was more comfortable for both of us. Her room was at the front of the house and mine was at the back, closer to Yuki's cottage. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to a noise that I thought was thunder, but it wasn't followed by rain. The sound repeated rhythmically, as if someone was beating a drum. Such an assumption seemed even more absurd, but the noise didn't stop. I hadn't dreamed it. I got up, threw on my robe, slipped my feet into my slippers. In the living room, a disturbed Laura was scurrying about, clawing at the carpet. I looked out the window. At the door of the cottage, I could hardly make out a dark figure pounding on the door. There was a faint light behind the tightly closed curtains. The man at the door continued to drum. It was becoming unbearable. Taking a flashlight, I jumped out of the house and ran downstairs to the cottage. The flashlight beam illuminated Justin's face. He was the one standing in front of the door, pounding on it with his fists. The painter's face was gone. Black shadows lingered around his eyes, and his mouth was contorted in a grimace of pain and despair. He looked like the soul of a sinner in hell. When he saw me, he didn't stop. He looked at me with a slanting, anguished gaze and began pounding at the door again, as if he had to fulfill this duty in spite of everything. "For God's sake, stop it!" I shouted at him. "Stop it! Stop it at once! Leave me alone!" "I won't. This is my land. You're keeping us awake with your antics." "All right, I won't knock anymore." He's got his hands down. "Now go away." After being assured that he wouldn't make any more noise, I left. There was nothing I could do to help Justin. He was just not himself. I lay awake for at least another hour, waiting for the rumbling to start again, but it didn't. Everything was quiet, but as I was falling asleep, I heard a thin, shrill cry in the distance, like an animal being tortured somewhere. But I could have imagined it. I awoke early, though I had not slept well, and began the morning with the simple task of feeding Laura. When I looked out into the garden, a mist was spiraling over the lake, and it seemed to me that something dark was floating on the surface. I seemed to know intuitively what I would find there. I unlocked the balcony door and ran down the grassy slope to the lake. A man's body was bobbing on the surface of the water, face down. I waded into the water and pulled him toward the shore. Of course it was Justin. Of course he was dead. His mouth was open as if in a frantic scream. Running, I went back to the house to make the call, passing the small pond behind Yuki's cottage on the way. There on the bank, I saw the second body, also lying flat, dressed in a peach silk kimono. The silk was torn and covered with blood. The whole body was bruised and wounded, but as I turned the woman over onto her back, I saw that her head was intact. That was strange, but far stranger and more eerie was the fact that her face, framed by such familiar black hair, shiny and with a single white strand, was not only bruised but had no sign of a face proper. The entire regular oval where her eyes, nose, mouth, and chin should have been located was a flat space covered with soft peach skin. The skin seemed to be tightly stretched as if on a drum.
Subscribe to our channel. Don't miss new and very scary stories.